right? So the people who paid the money to subsidize the vehicles only to turn around and try to buy that same vehicle that wasn't available because it got crushed, so they had to spend more for that same vehicle down the street at the next guy.
Yep.
Cash for clunkers. What a nightmare. One of the things that the geniuses came up with in Washington, Barack Obama and the idiots that were working for him at the time, was a cash for clunkers program meant to get people to buy cars and to reinvigorate the car companies, because as we know, the car companies were so terribly ran. GM in particular were so terribly ran. Pontiac also, that they were essentially bankrupt and could not afford any disruption in their business. Ford, on the other hand, found themselves in relatively the same position, but they didn't want to do anything with the government, and so they essentially mortgaged their name, Ford, and the Ford brand. I believe it was for $5 billion, if memory serves. It was a lot of money, and that was the money. Alan Mulally was the name of the CEO at the time. Dude was a genius. He knew what he was doing. He gets $5 billion. It might have been $8 billion against his name. That's the value of the Ford brand, not the Ford company. And he mortgaged that, if you will, and got that money brought in from outside banks. And they were able to get out of it without any government subsidies, unlike GM, which was such a huge, I'm trying not to cuss, so such a huge nightmare that they had to have money, which, of course, as you guys all know, when you need money from the government for things that you effed up on your own, you just make a phone call. That's what I would do. Billy, is that what you would do?
Definitely.
Your house doesn't work out with the renter, and all of a sudden the value goes, we're just going to call. Who do you call, Bill? You call the mayor? Who do you call?
The government, yeah.
You just call the governor?
Yeah. They fix it.
Yeah, they'll fix it, and then they'll give you the money to subsidize you to get through it.
You bet. And I keep the house and everything.
Yeah. Perfect. Good. Well, so, I mean, that's what they did. They did what all the rest of us did, which is they called their buddies, and all of a sudden, Obama administration's pumping billions of dollars into these companies and then fleecing us in ways that we couldn't see. And one of the ways that we couldn't see it was through the Cash for Clunkers program. And the Cash for Clunkers program was essentially what it sounds like. You bring any car in. They also did it they sold it under the auspices of helping clean the environment, right? You bring any car in, piece of crap, and you get a guaranteed amount of money for that POS. And I believe it was attached to as long as you bought a new car. So you forget about the amount of debt you're loading people up with, right? But you're also removing all of these cars. And the part of the stipulation was the car had to be crushed. So they crushed the car. No more market for used cars. New cars are selling like hotcakes. Interest rates are low. Subsidized interest rates are low. And all of a sudden, the guy that wants the $5,000 car can't find it because the $5,000 car is now $10,000. And all the cars on his street that he thought he could buy have all been crushed because people turn them in, cheap interest rates, factories pumping out vehicles, and they're buying them left and right. And the government is subsidizing those vehicles. I want to say it was like $5,000 or something. It was a ton of money. They spent tens of billions, if not hundreds of, I'm going to guess tens of billions of dollars, and they have absolutely nothing to show for it but higher prices to all of the people who want to buy used cars. Right? So the people who paid the money to subsidize the vehicles only to turn around and try to buy that same vehicle that wasn't available because it got crushed, so they had to spend more for that same vehicle down the street at the next guy.
Yep.
Cash for clunkers. What a nightmare.
Beautiful.
So complete failure, right? Billions of your dollars dumped down a hole, never to be seen again. It didn't work, needless to say, and it's now a relic of history. But so now we have, as of this morning, I looked it up before I did my post, 45% increase in the price of used cars over the last year. 45%. So you have the same impact, cash for clunkers. Why is that? Well, Billy, back to economics class. Why would the price of something rise so quickly? What would cause that to happen? So it's the opposite of what we were talking about relative to the dollar.
Well, the demand goes up. So as people lose their jobs and are getting guaranteed money from the government or a quick $1,000 or two, they turn around and spend that money to buy used cars, which increases demand, which increases the cost.
unless there's more used cars magically come out of somewhere, right? So you have huge demand and you have very little inventory, and from that you get this massive run up in used cars. Now, what could cause that? Maybe people can't afford to buy new cars.
Hmm.
Like you said, Billy, they're taking their money. That's going to be number one, two, and three. People simply can't afford anymore to buy a new car. Why can't they afford to buy a new car? Because they're so damn expensive. Now, I've railed about this before. We're kind of all over the place here, but I'm having fun. The You got to remember about 30% of the price of a car, and it's probably going up, I'm going to assume, but about 30% of the price of the car that you pay today is all mandated by the government. So the government mandates that they put that there be side bags and that there be disc brakes and there be a camera on the back and there be this extra and this deal and seat belts. I mean, cars are going to have seat belts, but everything that we now take for granted that you go pay $35,000 for a car that you might have otherwise been able to pay $28,000 for. You don't even think about it. You go, God, cars are expensive. Meanwhile, they look like POSs, right? There's no flair. There's no style of cars anymore.
Made out
Limited
of cheap
edition
plastic.
cars. Certainly, yeah, they're cheap. They're plastic. Why is that? The government mandates that. The government tells the car buyers or the car makers what their cars can look like, how they can ride, what they've got to have in them. Front ends, the Corvette had to get rid of its front end because it didn't throw people over the front when you ran them over. So instead of having that pointed front end, they had to bring it out so that when you hit that person, they'll fling up over the top of the car rather than be sucked underneath. That's a rule. That's a law. That's a regulation. You can't make this up. So that's the ridiculousness that we're dealing with when it comes to making these cars. So all of that goes into not only the things looking like every other car. You ever notice how every car looks like every other car now? There's no differentiation between even a supercar and many of the I mean, you can go buy a Corvette that I mistake for a Ferrari every time I see it, right, from afar, and it's $40,000. Well, how's Ferrari feel about that? So it's because the government has made it so difficult for anybody to stand out like they did when I was a kid. I was born in 1969. In the 70s, cars were complete POSs because that's where the government really started to get involved. But in the 60s, as you know, Billy, you're a car guy. Those things were fantastic, right? So we went from huge fins and things that looked like rocket ships and all
Solid
kinds
metal.
of all metal, yes, and all kinds of artistic license that was taken and design. And generally speaking, most of the cars stood out. They were particularly, especially today. There were a few clunkers right there through the 60s, but generally speaking, those cars were badass. And anybody that looks at it from all over the world too, not just in the United States, but the United States really in the 50s and 60s took it to another level. The government steps in 1972, ostensibly to fight pollution, and the whole thing takes a dump. And you have just these nightmare cars from the 1970s and us propping up, of course, the automobile companies because nobody can lose their jobs and competition isn't allowed to flourish. So that inflation, that cars are a perfect example of how inflation is a tax on you and me. And it's a tax that the politicians love to use because it's not one that you can see until it becomes hyper.
Yep.
So when it becomes hyperinflation, that's when you go in to buy milk Tuesday, your kid drinks it over the next 2 days faster than he might normally do it, and you go back and that milk is 40 cents more than it was 3 days earlier.